Today is October 25, 2025. A seemingly minor event has triggered a major diplomatic fallout. A short advertisement sponsored by the Government of Ontario has led to an abrupt stop in trade negotiations. The ad featured edited audio from a 1987 speech by former U.S. President Ronald Reagan. In the clip, Reagan speaks critically about the negative impacts of tariffs. The message was broadcast across American television stations to build support against U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods. Instead, it provoked an immediate response from the White House, casting a dark cloud over North American trade. The situation escalated with incredible speed. Just hours later, U.S. President Donald Trump posted on his social media platform with a stunning announcement. All trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated. That statement halted months of careful diplomatic work, talks that had been making progress just days before collapsed. The move shocked officials in Ottawa and officials in Washington. It left businesses and workers on both sides of the border uncertain. This highlights the fragile nature of international diplomacy today. The ad was meant to sway public opinion and pressure policymakers. The U.S. administration, however, interpreted it as a direct, hostile act. The incident shows how quickly communication can break down when trust is low. Context matters. The U.S.-Canada trade relationship is one of the largest and most integrated in the world. Billions of dollars in goods and services cross the border every day. Recent negotiation progress offered hope for resolving tariff disputes that hurt key industries. Trolley, the automotive sector in Ontario. The collapse of talks is not just a headline. It has immediate, tangible consequences for millions who depend on this stable economic relationship. They argued that U.S. tariffs on foreign goods were ultimately harmful to American workers, businesses, not just Canadian ones. To deliver this message with more impact, the ad creators chose to use the words of a revered American political figure. The ad featured a carefully selected audio clip from a radio address given by former President Ronald Reagan on April 25, 1987. In the chosen segment, Reagan's voice is heard criticizing protectionist trade policies. The creators felt this aligned with Reagan's broader pro-trade philosophy, but the execution quickly drew criticism. The Ronald Reagan Foundation publicly stated that the ad misrepresents the former president's speech. The foundation noted that the Ontario government had not sought permission to use the audio. They also pointed out that the clip was edited and presented without its original context, which they argued was a significant distortion of Reagan's full message. Others pointed out the overall theme of Reagan's complete 5-minute speech from 1987 was a strong endorsement of free trade, fair trade. The speech was a critique of protectionist measures being debated in Congress. While the editing may have been technically unauthorized and lacking full context, the core message of the ad was not entirely out of step with Reagan's known economic principles. This nuance, however, was lost in the ensuing political firestorm, as the focus shifted from substance to the perceived audacity of using a former president's words in a foreign political campaign. Premier Doug Ford defended the campaign's intent. He said the goal was never to be confrontational, but to initiate a conversation about the kind of economy Americans want to build. He claimed the campaign had reached audiences at the highest levels of the U.S. government, media. Ford framed the ad as a way to connect directly with the American people, bypassing traditional diplomatic channels to make a case for more integrated and mutually beneficial economic partnership. However, the approach clearly backfired, perceived not as a friendly conversation, but as a direct challenge. The American response to the advertisement was not just negative, it was explosive. President Donald Trump viewed the ad as a deliberate and hostile act. In a series of posts on his Truth Social platform, he condemned the Canadian campaign. He labeled the advertisement fake. He claimed that Canada had fraudulently used President Reagan's words. His reaction went beyond simple criticism. He framed it as a direct and inappropriate attempt by a foreign government to meddle in U.S. affairs. He alleged that its timing and content were specifically designed to interfere with the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. This linked the ad to a highly sensitive legal battle over the president's authority to impose tariffs. By doing that, he elevated the dispute from trade to a matter of national sovereignty and legal integrity. That framing provided the justification for his dramatic next step in the conflict. In a message capitalized for emphasis, President Trump announced, "All trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated." This was not a warning or a threat of future action, it was a statement of immediate effect. The decision instantly nullified the progress that had been made in recent weeks. It sent a shockwave through the diplomatic community. It also sent a shockwave through the business world. This move is characteristic of what some economists and analysts call a key risk of the Trump 2.0 era. It demonstrates a willingness to use trade negotiations as a tool of political leverage. It also shows a readiness to blow up fragile talks at a moment's notice. The abrupt cancellation of talks based on a single advertisement illustrates high volatility in U.S. trade policy. This unpredictability creates significant economic uncertainty, as businesses cannot make long-term investment decisions, when the rules of trade can be rewritten or abandoned with a single social media post, leaving entire industries in a state of limbo. President Trump's claim that the Canadian ad was meant to interfere with the U.S. Supreme Court was not a random accusation. It was tied to a specific and high-stakes legal case scheduled to be heard by the nation's top court in early November. This case challenges the very foundation of the Trump administration's global tariff regime. At its heart, the legal battle is about the extent of presidential power. The key question: does the president have the authority to unilaterally impose broad tariffs, or does that power rest with Congress? The case reached the Supreme Court after a lower appellate court issued a major ruling. That court had declared the tariffs illegal, creating a direct conflict only the Supreme Court could resolve. The stakes are enormous. If the court finds the president lacks constitutional power and also lacks statutory power, the consequences would be far-reaching. The U.S. government might have to refund billions to companies that paid customs duties for years, a move with major impact on the U.S. Treasury. This explains why the White House was so sensitive to the Canadian ad campaign. President Trump's post on Truth Social said, "They only did this to interfere with the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court," and added, "and other courts." From his perspective, the ad was a calculated political maneuver. He thought it was time to sway public opinion and perhaps influence the judicial environment just before oral arguments. Whether the ad could actually have that effect is debatable, but the perception of interference triggered a severe reaction. The link between the ad and the court case adds a complex layer to the dispute. It turns a trade spat into a clash over legal principles and the separation of powers. The trade relationship between the United States and Canada is one of the most significant economic partnerships in the world. According to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, the total value of goods and services trade between the two countries reached an incredible US $909.1 billion in 2024. That breaks down to about US $2.7 billion worth of goods and services crossing the border every single day. This flow supports millions of jobs and integrates supply chains across many industries. Canada's economic reliance on its southern neighbor is especially pronounced. More than 77% of all Canadian exports are destined for the United States. Any disruption to that relationship has an immediate, disproportionate impact on the Canadian economy. President Trump's steep tariffs, especially on goods like steel, aluminum, have already taken a toll. Those measures have particularly hurt Canada's automotive sector, a cornerstone of Ontario's economy, where complex supply chains see parts and vehicles cross the border multiple times before final assembly. Recent progress in negotiations had offered a path to ease some of that pain. Officials on both sides called the negotiations productive. As recently as the Wednesday before the collapse, talks were making progress, signaling a resolution might have been within reach. The sudden halt now puts that potential progress in jeopardy. Faced with the immediate and severe backlash from the United States, the government of Ontario moved quickly to de-escalate the situation. Premier Doug Ford announced that the province would pause its controversial anti-tariff ad campaign. The controversial ad, still showing Ronald Reagan's image, remained central to the story. He explicitly stated that the purpose of this pause was to create an opening so that trade talks can resume. However, the pause was not as immediate or complete as it might have seemed. He confirmed that the ad would not be pulled right away. It was scheduled to continue running during the Major League Baseball World Series games over the weekend before being halted on Monday. This move allowed the province to get one last major broadcast in, but it also risked being seen by the White House as a defiant final gesture rather than a sincere act of conciliation. In his public statements, Premier Ford attempted to frame the entire campaign as a success, despite the diplomatic crisis it had caused. He reiterated that the primary intention was to start a conversation about the negative effects of tariffs on both American and Canadian workers. "We've achieved our goal," he declared. having reached U.S. audiences at the highest levels. The decision to pause the ad campaign, rather than end it permanently, leaves the door open for it to be restarted in the future. This ambiguity may not be enough to fully repair the damage done to the trust between negotiators. The situation remains fragile. In the wake of the collapsed trade talks, Canadian leaders have adopted a dual strategy. Publicly, they are maintaining a calm and open stance toward the United States. Privately and strategically, they are accelerating efforts to reduce the country's economic dependence on its southern neighbor. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney responded to President Trump's announcement with a measured tone. He stated that Canada is prepared to resume trade talks when the Americans are ready. The message positions Canada as the reasonable, patient party, ready to engage in diplomacy. Carney also acknowledged the limits of Canada's influence over American policy. He remarked that his country can't control the trade policy of the U.S. At the same time, he emphasized that the now-canceled negotiations had yielded a lot of progress, suggesting a viable path forward if talks could be restarted. Even before this recent diplomatic crisis, Canada had already begun laying the groundwork for a significant shift in its long-term trade strategy. Prime Minister Carney had previously announced an ambitious plan to diversify Canada's export markets. The core mission is to double the country's non-US exports within the next decade. Our core mission is to build a stronger economy, one that doesn't rely on a single trade partner. This strategy involves strengthening trade ties with the Asia-Pacific region, Europe, other emerging markets. The current fallout with the United States will almost certainly add a new sense of urgency to this diversification plan. In the long run, this strategic pivot could fundamentally reshape Canada's place in the global economy, making it less vulnerable to the political whims of its closest ally. With trade talks officially terminated by the United States, the future of this critical economic relationship is uncertain. There are several possible paths that events could take in the coming weeks and months. Each potential outcome carries its own set of risks and opportunities for both nations. The most optimistic scenario is that talks resume relatively quickly. This would likely require some behind-the-scenes diplomacy to rebuild trust. Canada might need to offer a firm commitment to avoid similar public relations campaigns, and the U.S. might need to step back from its hardline stance. If both sides recognize that a prolonged dispute hurts their own economies, a rapid return to the negotiating table is possible. A second, more likely outcome is a prolonged slowdown in negotiations. High-level talks may remain frozen, while lower-level officials keep lines of communication open on technical issues. However, this approach would mean that the most damaging tariffs on steel, aluminum, other goods would remain in place indefinitely. A more pessimistic possibility is a complete and extended stall in negotiations, with existing tariffs remaining and potential new ones imposed. It would force businesses to consider relocating supply chains and could trigger a new era of protectionism in North America. Finally, the U.S. Supreme Court's decision on tariff authority could reshape the entire landscape, weakening or strengthening the administration's negotiating hand. To summarize the events of this turbulent week, a Canadian advertising campaign triggered the collapse of trade talks with the U.S. The ad from Ontario used edited audio of Ronald Reagan to argue against tariffs. Trump reacted furiously and called it a fake ad. He accused Canada of trying to interfere with an upcoming U.S. Supreme Court case and declared an immediate end to all trade negotiations. That abruptly stopped talks that had been making progress on U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, hitting sectors like the auto industry hard. Ontario Premier Doug Ford paused the ad campaign to allow talks to resume, but the ad still aired during the World Series before being pulled. The Ronald Reagan Foundation criticized the ad, saying it misrepresented Reagan's words and was used without permission. Canadian leaders, including Mark Carney, say Canada is ready to resume talks whenever the U.S. is willing, while pursuing diversification to reduce reliance on the U.S. For now, two close allies and trading partners stand at a diplomatic impasse.